We now open the conference to questions. Unfortunately, we have only got one working microphone, yeah. I think we'll start here, yes. We'll take a clump of questions first. Could you keep your questions fairly brief, to the point?
Questions for Dr. Kumar about the relationship between revolution and nationalism, and I'm wondering what sort of comments you might have on German National Socialism, which was in its own way quite revolutionary and also exceedingly nationalist, and how you think they squared that circle and the extent to which they succeeded in doing it. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And our second, sorry, no, I think we'll take two or three, and then yeah, there are two people here at the back, and then yeah, and yeah, well, okay, we'll take a final fourth one here too. Yeah. Could you say who you are briefly?
Nabulsi from the University of Barcelona.
Yeah, okay.
It's a question for Professor Kumar. I have been surprised at the examples that you have chosen for illustrating your argument. All three are from European origin. And I was wondering if you could answer your argument with respect to nationalism, whether it could be applied to the rest of the world, because it seems that it could be a little bit forceful.
Eric Halsey, currently affiliated with Fulbright, Bulgaria, and research. This is a question for Mrs. Nabulsi. That, okay, looking at then kind of trying to see popular sovereignty as central to revolution, is there a danger then in maybe not focusing as much on the fact that popular sovereignty is often a tool of otherization, that the populace that popular sovereignty references to is very often exclusionary and maybe used in different ways by different people. So when they say popular sovereignty, they might mean different populations.
Yeah, and finally, yeah, Montserrat.
I'm Montserrat Gimena, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary, University of London. Thank you very much to the two speakers for great talks. My question is to Professor Kumar. The question is, I know that you've been talking, that you stopped at 1917, but in terms of talking about revolutions, but I was wondering whether you could give us some reflections on lessons learned or patterns that emerge in those revolutions and could be helpful or not to understand revolutions during the Arab Spring. I mean, whether you could comment on these revolutions, you know, but on the most recent ones. Thank you.
Okay, well, please. Who would like to start? Krishnan? Yeah. It should work, yes. Oh, no, that's but you please speak into the microphone. But, yeah.
The first question, I think, was to do about the National Socialist Revolution of 1933. Is that the one you had in mind?
Yeah, I meant from 1919 on the
I mean, that's an interesting one. There's an interpretation of the 1848 revolutions that says it leads straight to 1933. And actually, in some ways, that's the interpretation I was drawing upon. It's the interpretation of the British historian Louis Mania in his Raleigh lecture, the 1848 Revolution of the Intellectuals. And he cites people like Wilhelm Jordan, the man whose quote I was desperately looking for in my talk, on healthy national egotism, the rights of the Germans. And he says this more or less directly leads to 1933 and other points perhaps earlier of the assertion of a very, very aggressive German nationalism. So for him, 1848 already contains the principles of 1933. He sees the link between revolution and nationalism already contained in the deliberations and speeches in the Frankfurt Parliament. Now I know that John Brolin, is John here? John has taken issue with Nameley's interpretation. If you look at the chapter in the second edition of Nationalism and the State, it's a very interesting discussion of Nameley on 1848, and John thinks he exaggerates, which he does, I think. I mean, drawing too close a line between 1848 and 1933 is clearly wrong, or rather excessive. But nevertheless, if you read the speeches of the parliamentarians, German particularly, and if you look at the actions of the Germans in places like Posen and Bohemia, it's not 1933, but you can see the seeds, I think, of what was capable under the guise of nationalism. So I would say, I mean, my general feeling is that Mania, on the whole, was right to see in 1848 the seeds of many of the later connections between nationalism and revolution. Shall I continue?
Yeah, well, yes, and then Carmen.
Another question about, was my argument, I think, related only to European examples, or could it be extended to the rest of the world? I think there's no reason why it shouldn't be extended to the rest of the world, partly because both the principles of nationalism and revolution became, I think, the property of the whole world. I don't think there's any doubt that these were ideas that were exported in all kinds of ways, particularly by the empires. You know, empires carry many, many ideas, many of which are actually inimical to imperialism itself. The revolution and nationalism rapidly in the 19th century became the property of the whole world. So I think you could apply the same sorts of analyses, of course, with the recognition of specific differences. But I mean, you say you take something like the Chinese Revolution of 1949 as a non-European example. It's classic, I think, there. What happened there was very similar in many ways to what happened in 1917. Except that nationalism perhaps was there more clearly right from the outset. The Chinese communists made their reputation in China because they were the only ones who seriously fought the Japanese. And I'm quite sure, as Chalmers Johnson, I think, argued some time ago, that the revolution of 1949 was March nationalists as communists. So I think, and you could take Cuba, you could take Vietnam. I'm sure you could look at some of the other examples, Mexican Revolution too, perhaps 1911, and find ways in which something of the same pattern can be said to emerge. As for Montserrat's question about do the lessons of 1917 and others apply to the Arab Spring, I have to say I simply just don't know.
Well, I think Carmen can answer.
I have to apologise. I simply don't know enough about the Arab Spring to say whether they do or don't. But I think there is somebody here who knows a lot about it. I'm sure to answer that question.
What was the question precisely about 1848 and the Arab Spring?
I think you were just saying, you mentioned 1917 in particular, didn't you? But you just
1917.
Whether what I'd said about these revolutions could in any way be applied to the example of the Arab Spring.
I mean, and just to, can I put the two questions together in one answer? Because I think it kind of goes together in what I was trying to sketch out, which was another way of looking at revolutions and another way of tracing them, which could make understandable some kind of traditional lineage. So by placing popular sovereignty, by placing what the revolutionaries themselves were doing, the historical context of the predicament they were facing, which is, you know, China, and of course they were fighting for independence, etc., the Chinese communists at the time, and you could say that's nationalism, and you could say that, you know, when you're looking at what revolutionaries themselves are trying to institute, trying to build towards, you have a political understanding of the predicament, but also the goal, which, if you look at popular sovereignty, and I know what you're saying, people included or excluded, etc., but you look at it, it's basically saying, where does sovereignty lie? Does it lie up here with the king, with the foreign invader, with this, or does it rest with us, the people, so named as they saw it at that time? And that changes over time, the understanding of who the people are, of course. It's not always so homogeneous as the Springtime of Nations. You know? But you can't look at the Springtime of Nations without looking at the project to overcome empire and to institute the social contract and free republics. So it was by saying, you know, you can have an understanding of nationalism as an ideology. I'm kind of more with Michael Frieden on that one. I don't think it's an independent ideology. I think it's always imbued by the political framework with what it's in. But that if you look at popular sovereignty and how it's fought for, if you look at that principle that it's the people themselves, And that's why I gave the example of Egypt. I could do the same with Tunis. It gives you a framework for being able to understand. I mean, a lot of people were shocked by the Arab Spring. They tried to put economic reasons on this, or what were the things that, what were the factors that could lead to such a thing? So you can draw a direct line between 1830 to 34 and the work that was done in Europe between the French Revolution of the Trois Glorieuses up to the Lyon insurrection of 1834 and the aborted Frankfurt Revolution, straight through to 1848 in the work that was done in between. And you can trace, so it's more about tracing lineage. What's the thing that holds it together? That conception, that understanding is there, yeah, of the people that were engaged in it, both what they were facing and what they wanted to institute.
Yeah. I think we're ready for another round of questions. Yeah, John. While we're waiting, perhaps I can ask a question too. If I could briefly channel the spirit of Kaduri.
No.
Because he would have argued that nationalism and republicanism are versions of secular millenarianism, and they're inherently revolutionary, but also impossible to realize in this world. Nationalists claim to define who the people are, and so you could argue that republicanism is going to be absorbed by nationalism one way or the other. But you could say that nationalism is revolutionary in Kadurian times, not in terms of its transformation of social structures, but in terms of its transformation of territorial political organization of the world. All existing states are illegitimate unless they're legitimized by nationalist principles. So much so that international relations can barely speak about nationalism to this day. It doesn't have nationalism is the enemy. But anyway, John.
John Burley from ASEN. I think those two talks on this. It's to both of you. It seems to me that the way the two concepts are defined, they're either defined as intentional contradiction, or they are simply different sorts of things. One is about a mode of change, one is about a form of collective. And they seem therefore to have no necessary conceptual relationship at all. So it seems to me you don't get two kinds of arguments. One is about the essential contradiction or whatever. The other is about the contingent relationship. And one might argue the Marxist line that it's classes that carry revolutions. One might argue a revolution tradition is certain kinds of activists. But what about this as a suggestion? It seems that revolutions typically go through two stages. An optimistic stage, non-institutional, universal ideas, and a pessimistic, realistic, organising, long-term phase. We associate nationalism with the second phase. But we also associate nationalism with romanticism. That's wrong. Perhaps nationalism is simply about constrained politics as opposed to unconstrained politics. But eventually you have to work with the institutions you've got, and you then give values to those, and romantic nationalism provides the language to do that. And incidentally, the phrase that Jonas wanted to use is springtime of the peoples.
Exactly.
So it's a nightmare of the nation.
Okay. And over here, and then here. Yeah. We shall. Yeah. And again, if we can keep your questions brief, we might have time for another round over here.
Thank you. We are working at University, Princeton University. Question for Professor Nabulsi. I was wondering if you are defining the hidden treasure of revolution as popular sovereignty, and generally we do ascribe that principle to modernity. Would you argue that revolution innately is a modern phenomenon? And would you complement the principle of popular sovereignty with another principle that is based on peoplehood, which is self-determination with the capacity to reshape state borders?
Back here.
I'm a PhD student in history.
Could you speak up a bit, yes?
I'm a PhD candidate in history from Princeton University. And I have a question for Professor Kumar. I'm curious as to how you would see this dichotomy between revolution and nationalism, the transition from one to the other, playing out in self-determination movements and anti-colonial movements in the 50s and 60s. Because it seems to me that this movement in particular, you you see a marriage between both principles of self-determination, which are universal, and at the same time they're very strongly nationalized. And I think if you look at the non-aligned movement, for example, they are coming together because they believe in the same principle, but they're doing so along very grounded national lines.
Okay. Yeah. Carl, would you like to start? Yeah?
One was a comment,
Yes.
which was really interesting, and I wrote. Yeah, you know, the thing about the bonded realistic implementation of the principle, and saying that that's not the romantic part. I think it's quite interesting that kind of that contingency between the two. And if we want to go back to the more recent example that I close with, which was about Egypt, here you have not a project against a foreign, supposedly not against a foreign occupier of this, so it's not the kind of nation having. But you could see that it was the Egyptian people reclaiming the national institutions. And so you could give an analysis of, well, who owned those institutions? And you could say the authoritarian regime, etc. But the army was actually, and is owned to this day by the Americans. It's 100% owned by the Americans. So what was very interesting was the discussions of the press and people about what is the army going to do, as if it was an independent actor, yeah, in Egypt, and it's not. It's a foreign actor, and it was doing exactly what the Americans were saying. Now there were some constraints there because the Americans were able to constrain them from mowing down people, you know, which you don't see in some of how it played out in Yemen and other places. But the institution of those freedoms, you know, that's why I go back to the social contract and republicanism in that way, that what you have is the institutions through which you try to institute the freedoms that you've gained. Do you own those institutions? Did the people claim it? They claimed those institutions, but they didn't own those institutions entirely. You know, a French philosopher would say something like republicanism or revolution, it's never achieved. Go back to the Kadoorie thing, it's never achieved, it's always a struggle to create liberties. And I would always say that, you know, when people were talking about the Arab Spring or the revolutions that happen and are unfolding, that, you know, there's all these models that they could export there. And the thing is, to me, it's so much clearer that those freedoms and the limits of freedoms are so much better understood by people who are having to fight for them. You know, here we're living in tremendous freedoms, but they were won by other people. They weren't won by our generation. We're just managing them or throwing them away. But if you look at the people in the Arab world who have been fighting for freedom and have been living under authoritarian rule, they know the measure of it exactly because they know how hard, you know, because they're, so those kinds of very sophisticated political understandings, and that's what I was trying to say, we have to restore in order to understand revolutions. You have to look at what the people are doing and saying and writing themselves, rather than the commentary on them in that way. So to touch on that, yeah, I'm not that much a fan of the kind of literature on modernity, so I don't know exactly how I would frame that, but I think the national self-determination of peoples, the concept of peoples, is always there with the contract, you know, the understanding of the social contract, of how the people determine themselves. And of course, many peoples determine themselves within many nationalisms. You have Great Britain, you have many nationalisms within, and they've decided we are a people, and that's where we live in and determine our freedoms and govern our laws ourselves. Yeah? But that notion is always there, and so I just think a lot of the literature on nationalism really depoliticizes what is a very political engagement.
Yeah.
My comment, in a way, on a number of the questions might cover them all. And I think, particularly in response to what John Hutchison just said about nationalism and revolution, I think nationalism can be subversive. It is indeed subversive, as Kadoorie says. And in that sense, it's an unrealizable ideal to set up. But it isn't necessarily revolutionary in the way that revolutions in the past, at least, tried to set forth their goals. And I think we can see this if we turn to this concept of self-determination. The question was asked about how do these principles apply to a notion like self-determination? Are they both contained within it? I think yes, they are. They are. And again, I refer back to Gidori's book on nationalism. I think these days it's cited, but not much read. But he traces, I think, very nicely the origins of the notion of self-determination to Kant, to the philosophy of Kant, which is concerned mainly with individual self-determination, individual fulfillment, and it's then lifted to a collective claim, mainly by followers like Fichte, rather than by Kant himself. And that's how it then becomes one of the building blocks of a nationalist ideology. So you could say that all revolutions surely must be about some concept of individual self-fulfillment. They are about liberation, they're about freedom in all kinds of different ways. But the when it moves from the individual to the collective, a change of means seems almost inevitable, and it will lead also to a change of ends. And I think particularly if you look at what happened in 1918, or after 1918, when the principle of self-determination really came into its own with Nabulsi, and the outcome of applying that principle, because you had to then decide who the people were, who were the nation. And you've got oddities like Czechoslovakia, there was a Czechoslovak people. You've got Poland, with a whole series of minorities, Germans and others, in the so-called self-determined state of Poland. And almost every example you can think of, the principle of self-determination led to massive contradictions and irregularities, and a hopeless mess, I think, in the interwar period, which showed itself. So, while in principle, in theory, you're right, revolution and nationalism can be contained within the concept of self-determination, when it comes to practice, I think they do end up going in very different directions.
We've got time for just two more questions here, and could you keep them brief, because we've got to stop in about 5 minutes before the AGM. Yeah.
I'm Arthur Waldron from the University of Pennsylvania, and I just wanted to, first, my friend Krishnan mentioned a book that was very influential on our generation, Chalmers Johnson, supporting the idea that in China, really communism and nationalism overlap, because the communists were the ones fighting the Japanese. And I'm going to talk about this tomorrow evening, but I just wanted to put down a flag now, which is that the latest scholarship, which is now becoming very massive, argues quite the opposite. It argues that the communists scarcely fought the Japanese at all. In fact, there are only 2 battles that you can name, whereas the vast majority of the casualties were taken by the Nationalist Party, and their allies, 200 divisions, 100 divisions of nationalists, 100 divisions of allies. They're the ones that took the casualties, and this is now leading to a considerable political and sort of historiographic rethinking in China. I just want to mention that.
Okay.
Alan Knight from Oxford. It seems to me if you want to put it very closely to electric between nationalism and revolution, you have to look at the other side as well. And particularly by the 20th century, it seems to me arguable that nationalism pervades the whole political spectrum. So that in the case of the Russian Revolution, it'd be hard to argue, I think, that say Kornilov and Tsarist and counter-revolutionists are not nationalists. They may be different, you may wish to make nuanced differences, but it does seem to me if you just pick the writings and the thoughts of revolutionists, you miss the fact that nationalism is ubiquitous. And though I don't quite see it as a sort of diagnostic feature of revolutionaries as against probably anybody else. The one big group where of course that is not the case would be where you deal with anti-colonial revolutions or real wars of national liberation as in Vietnam and Algeria. There the link would be very close for obvious reasons. I'm not persuaded that Russia or Mexico, which you mentioned, really fits that argument.
Well, firstly, just a quick response to Arthur Waldron. I'm extremely glad then that I didn't choose the Chinese Revolution. That is one of my examples. I just threw it in later. So I'm looking forward to your own account tomorrow of that. On this question about, I think that's the point that the second point was made about the pervasiveness of nationalism in the 20th century. It's really important. And I think this is one of the ways in which one has to become very historically minded about the concepts themselves as they evolved and the relationships between them. Because what happened in the French Revolution was one thing when the concepts were in the process of being formed and people were not particularly clear and they had not been very widely diffused, to 100 years later, when both of these principles have become totally diffused across the world and suffused the political culture of most nations. So that we're in a different world, I think, then. And talking about relations between revolution and nationalism post, say, 1917 and 1789 involves a different form of discussion. Again, perhaps that's why I stopped my own discussion in 1917. You know, when you read accounts of revolutions, they tend to either focus on these sort of classic European revolutions, 1789, 1848, 1917, and they stop there and have a kind of little paragraph or two about the 20th century revolution. Or their books about the 20th century revolution with a bit of a glance back. But overlapping the two is difficult because of this very feature of diffusion and a kind of interference effect that the very presence of this ideology so strongly. So yes, I suppose you cannot have a revolution in the 20th century that isn't nationalist in some sense. You know, nationalism is part of the very core of the being of the whole revolution. It's getting beyond nationalism, perhaps, a really difficult thing in the 20th century.
Carol, would you like to have a final word?
Sure. I mean, I'm in the midst of writing this book that I write one chapter a year in the summer because it takes me to the archives and it's a long, long project. I thought it was going to take me a lot less time, but it's actually tracing those that were involved in the Republican and Revolutionary project between 4 very short years, 1830 to 1834. And what's quite interesting about that period, you could see that the protagonists who came from Poland, Greece, France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, were all refugees. They were all constructing to fight for free republics. They all had been involved in their own revolutions in their own countries, so were national in that way, in that project. But they all worked together, and they all designed their future as a collective project. The idea of instituting free republics was not, I'll come and help you fight your national war and then you'll come and help us fight ours, you know, between the cultures. It was that unless we design this as a collective, unless this is a collective, international, it will not succeed. Because, so that's that kind of link between the national and the international that is always there. And therefore, if you look at, after the normal line, you look at the national liberation movement, the ANC, SWAPO, all of them, they all worked together in the same way. They were not nationalists fighting for the nation. They were fighting for principles and instituting free institutions, free establishments for the collective good. And that's what I meant about the difference of what's driving the actors and why it's important to look at the actors themselves, what they were doing. And you can trace this group, the people that were the main people of their own, the protagonists of their own national revolutions, if you want to call them national, designing it, seeing it as a collective endeavor, an international endeavor. But also you can trace all of them straight through to 1848, through the associations and the work, and they were all there in 1848 as well. So, yeah, I'm on 1832 at the moment. 3 of the 5, but
yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for very stimulating talks and also for very interesting questions. If you could just stay with us for a few minutes, we now have the AGM. I'm not sure that the coffee will be poured until we finish down here.